Hi, this chapter is going to deal with a play called Ruined, written by Lynn Nottage. Let's move into knowing a little bit about the author or the playwright who has written Ruined. Her name is Lynn Nottage. Lynn Nottage is an American playwright, and her works often deal with the lives of marginalized people who, because of various social, political, cultural reasons, have been pushed to the margins of mainstream society. She was a professor, continues to be a professor at Columbia University, and she was the first and continues to be the only woman who has won the Pulitzer Prize twice for her plays. And in 2009, she won her first Pulitzer for the play Ruined, which we are going to discuss. And again in 2017, she won it again for another play that she wrote, the name of which is Sweat. Now, Lynn was very creative and artistic in the process as she was growing up, even as a child. She wrote her first full-length play called The Darker Side of Verona about an African-American Shakespeare company traveling through the South only when she was studying in her high school. And Lynn Nottage's works have a certain element of difference in the way the lives of marginalized people are oftentimes discussed, which is very different from the way it is usually put into narrative for the readers to peruse or for the audience members to watch. To give you an example of the kind of work that she used to do, we have Intimate Apparel, which was a work that she produced in 2003. And the inspiration for this work was her grandmother, who used to be a seamstress. Let's look at a little bit about what Intimate Apparel was actually about. In 1905, this is the plot of Intimate Apparel. In 1905, in New York, there lived a Black woman who was a seamstress, and her name was Esther. She lived in a boarding house for women, and she used to sew intimate apparel for clients whose status used to range from extremely wealthy women to white patrons to prostitutes as well. One by one, the other denizens, the other occupants of the boarding house slowly marry, or they find other purposes in life, or they find other pathways in life, and they leave the boarding house. And Esther remains lonely and longing for a husband, lonely and longing for companionship. Her plan is to find the right man and use the money that she'd actually saved in order to open a beauty parlor or a salon where Black women would be treated with equal royalty, would be treated with equal respect and dignity as white women often are treated in other salons where oftentimes Black women were not allowed to enter. This is the kind of work that she used to produce. This is the kind of work that she used to make. There was a way in which marginalization was represented, a way in which she showed how marginality or marginalism affected people's lives in different ways, and unique examples were taken by her in order to reflect this idea in a much louder way. This is Lynn Nottage. This is the author. Now, in 2008, Nottage wrote the play Ruined, and it won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama in 2009. Like I said, it was her first Pulitzer, which was followed by another Pulitzer in 2017. Now, the play Ruined focuses on the plight of women living in the Democratic Republic of Congo during the time of the civil war or civil violence that Congo was torn apart by for many, many years. Nottage and her director Kate Oriski traveled together to Uganda to interview women as background study for this play. This is what makes Ruined so powerful. It was not written with the perspective where she had no first-hand idea about what these experiences of women were. Lynn Nottage wanted to speak to the women who had gone through such atrocities, such horrible circumstances in life, and be inspired by their very personal experiences and bring as much genuineness and as much honesty as she could to her play. And that is how Ruined was born. It is a conventionally structured play, purposefully plotted, stocked with sympathetic characters and informative topical detail. It was very specific to the topic that it wanted to deal with, and Nottage made sure that all the stories that she tried to communicate through her play were real-life experiences, things, horrific events that women had gone through actually in their lives. And she wanted to bring that element of strength and power to her narrative. A quick overview of what the play is about, Ruined. It is set in a small mining town in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The most important, the most powerful character that you will see in this play is a woman called Mama Nadi. She is a woman in her 40s, probably, a very powerful, a very beautiful, woman who deals with so many difficult things all by herself. She owns a pool room and a bar that is open to all customers. It could be people representing the military, or it could be people representing any of the militant communities or civilian armed militant communities who used to ravage the area as well. While the country and its politics were deeply divided, Mama Nadi's bar did not have this division. Its doors were open to anybody who wanted to enjoy a drink, who wanted to eat something, or probably even admit themselves to any kinds of sexual or physical pleasures. Despite the attempt to stay neutral, you see that Mama Nadi finds that factions continuously disrupt around her, and the nearby towns and mines are destructed because of the civil violence. Mama Nadi's bar is open to all, and to quote from the text, her waitresses provide more than whiskey and food, which not only refers to the probability of physical pleasure, but it also could possibly refer to the idea of companionship, or the idea of having someone to listen to the kind of ravages that you've gone through. That is not entirely the case all the time, because most of the time the people who visited Mama Nadi's bars were either militant leaders or military leaders, and they had no time to speak or listen because they had greater ideas of violence in their mind, which they found to be more important for that particular period in time. These are some of the important thoughts or points that you can keep in mind, and you can come back to it after you have probably gone through the entirety of the play. The first one, the woman's body is used as a tool for the exertion or the exchange of power and violence. And on the woman's body rests the honor of the community as well as the masculine pride of the militants involved in that particular violent endeavor. During the problems of partition back here in India, mostly women's bodies became battlegrounds as people or communities of people tried to prove their masculinity, and the entire body of violence was completely taken out on the bodies of women. A lot of writings also exist speaking about those horrific experiences. Here, the same thing happens. Women's bodies were treated as battlegrounds. It could be a militant community or it could be a military community. Women were perhaps the most affected communities of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo during the Civil War. Then you have the damages that this could do to women, which we discussed before, but it could also do a lot of damage to men as well. And it is the way Linnottage has actually communicated this to the rest of the world. War or violence destructs communities, destructs resources, it abuses and violates women, but at the same time, it has a much deeper impact on the men involved in the violence as well. Linnottage takes the examples of a lot of young boys holding huge AK-47 rifles and standing in different parts of the country, ready to do whatever they were asked to do because that is how they were raised. Violence was the language that was taught to them right from when they were very young kids, for that matter. The role of help and assistance and groups of people who gave assistance during the war. That is also a very, very important part in this discussion. When Linnottage and Kate Oriski visited Uganda in order to talk to the women who were affected by the ravages of war, it was these assistance groups, these communities of people whose lives were completely dedicated in order to bring peace, any sort of peace into the lives of these women whose everyday circumstances and environments were basically torn apart by the violence of war. War is both a personal trauma and a collective trauma. That is again another very important point to keep in mind as you go through this narrative. War is a personal trauma in every sense, where the people involved in it have losses to speak about. They have violence and other difficulties to talk about. But it is also a situation of collective trauma where people belonging to entire communities are deeply affected by the violence involved in war and the role of gender in war. How does war as a violent act affect people belonging to different gender identities living in a community that is torn apart by this kind of violence? These are some of the points that you can keep in mind as you move deeper into the play. To analyze the story, like I said, the bar that Mama Nadi lives in is a location where people belonging to different factions and different belief systems come together because they seem to have the same needs. And Mama Nadi, even though she tries to keep this as a space for pleasure, it is also a space of safety where young women belonging to the age groups of 18, 19, 20, etc. are saving themselves from the ravages and the violence of war that is happening around them, because Nadi knew that she would be able to keep these men away from violently abusing these young women. And characters such as Sophie, Salima, all young women who are brought under the care of Mama Nadi during the time of war, are all examples of young women, very different women who have gone through similar violent experiences, but the outcomes that they have gained mentally, physically, and psychologically from these ravages are very different. And this is how, Lynn Nottage has basically interestingly layered her narrative. And like I said, the characters of Sophie and Salima are very different. While Salima is a very defiant, strong woman who dislikes having to work like this, Sophie is different. She is intimidated by her environment, but at the same time, she is intelligent enough to stick on because she wants to escape this hellhole. And for that, she needs a very, very valuable resource, which is money. And she is intelligently using the space that she has in Mama Nadi's bar to stick along for long enough so that she can escape from this space in a more permanent manner. They don't talk about home, they don't talk about past, because they are very, very difficult topics to talk about. People like Sophie and Salima were physically abused by militants or military officers. They were robbed from their own homes and abused for days altogether, which leads to the real mutilation of their genital areas, a very, very painful and horrifying situation that most of these women had to go through, which made any further sexual endeavor impossible because it was extremely painful and even very damaging to their lives. And this sort of leads us to a more important point, which we will discuss shortly, which is the title of the play. It has more meanings than we would actually perceive them on a first read. Now, every woman in the play has been subjected to horrifying sexual violence, sexual crimes, but their families are not ready to accept them back because their, in inverted quotes, purity has been lost because of the kind of physical abuse that they were subjected to. This is the kind of rootlessness and homelessness and violence, not just from militant communities or military, but also from their own families that they have to face. The most important element in this play is survival. No matter what happens, you are going to have to stick on to make sure that you are alive through this, so that at some point you can escape and probably gain enough money through any kind of work that you're supposed to do, so that your genital mutilation can be medically dealt with and healed, so that a future life, a painless future life, is possible. Both physical and mental pain are deeply ingrained into this narrative because both were a huge problem during the war. There are two acts in the narrative, and I am not giving a scene-by-scene explanation because that is a possible activity for everyone. But what this session intends to do is to spark certain ideas, certain thought processes that you can perhaps take forward as you move into the reading of the play. You have a character called Christian, who's a traveling salesman, and he's a walking newspaper as far as the area or the various tin mines and villages are concerned, because he sells random goods to people, but he also collects news and brings them. We understand that Christian has an affinity, or Christian has a soft spot for Mama Nadi, and in many times through the narrative tries to speak to her about being together and living together, but Mama Nadi constantly puts the topic away for a reason that we will not understand until we come to the end of the play. Hypocrisy reigns in the entire narrative. Militant communities blame the military. The government and the military blame the militant communities for the violence that is happening in Congo. But nobody seems to be actually doing anything to make the situation better. And the abuse of power, abuse of people, both men, women, children, no matter what age, what gender, continues to flourish, even though they are different in their natures and different in their habits. The violence and the exploitation is common to everyone. To discuss some of the important themes, violence is used as a language of communication, and its gender variances are very interestingly spoken about in the play. The trauma of physical pain, it's not just mental or psychological trauma, but it is also the trauma of going through physical pain. The extent of genital mutilation which these women are subjected to is incredible, because they are in a situation where they cannot walk or do anything in their lives, and they have to slowly heal themselves, and life becomes possible. Life becomes a concept that they can at least think about only when the physical pain has gone away. So that's very important. The third one is the futility of war, which has been discussed globally for so long, but it still seems to miss the point somewhere. War is futile and it brings no winners, and everybody in one way or the other loses something which is very difficult to get back. There is a patriarchy of war where it requires men and young little boys of 10 and 12 years to be masculine, to be manly. And masculine and manly is equated with the ability to shoot someone dead, the ability to carry a Kalashnikov in your hand, the ability to intimidate women, to abuse them. And this creates a vicious cycle of exploitation and violence. Impermanence of lives, emotions, people, and places. Lynn Nottage, through the play Ruin, tries to tell you nothing is going to be permanent, especially in a community that is torn so much apart by the effects of war. And collective destruction. Everything is destructed. People, their lives, communities, resources, relationships, bodies, physical, mental existences of people are collectively destructed. And hope, the most powerful emotion that Nottage tries to communicate through people like Sophie, despite being genitally mutilated, despite going through so much physical and psychological pain, still holds on to so much hope because she wants to escape this kind of life. You have symbols which include the bar, which becomes a symbol of a merging of cultures or a merging of different opinions and objectives, as Mama Nadi's bar becomes a safe haven for the young women who get there. The AK-47s, which these young boys hold, is a symbol of not just the violence of patriarchal understandings of masculinity, but it is also the extent of violence and the extent of abuse and exploitation, which is so easily and casually communicated in the lives of people. Christians' goods for sale remind us of impermanence, but at the same time, it also reminds us of how every human being's life is so deeply affected if they live in a community that is ravaged by war. Coltan and diamonds are two of the most rich resources for which the landscape of Congo, like different parts of Africa, were destructed by not just the people living in the community, but also, from people who visited the land for their resources. What makes Africa beautiful is the abundance of resources which it had, but that also becomes the reason why their landscape, both physical, social, cultural, as well as human, were destructed in such a way. You have Sophie's stolen money. Sophie constantly steals money from Mama Nadi, but Mama Nadi knows this but says nothing despite being such a strict woman, because she knows that this money is not for luxury, but this money is to save her own life. We have a cooking pot that Fortune has in this narrative, which is also reflective of the kind of destruction that happened to relationships and understandings between people. And you have Mr. Aziz Harari, who is a diamond merchant who visits Mama Nadi's bar and frequently speaks to one of Mama Nadi's girls called Josephine, but gives her false hope. Aziz Harari is the symbol of an external force that enters a community with the idea of exploiting resources, with the readiness to go to whatever extent it may be, if it facilitates the availability of resources as and when required. Alcohol is a repetitive motive from the very beginning to the end of the play, and Mama Nadi's bar becomes a site for that. Dance is also there. It's built into the African cultural fabric. But here, dance is not accompanied by the kind of joy or the kind of spirituality that is usually seen in African cultural narratives. But here, it is a mode of escape, or it is a mode of activity which helps them forget their life circumstances even for a while. Questioning sessions, militant communities question people, the military questions people, they question each other and they point fingers at each other, but nothing leads to the ending of violence. Vague news of death and loss is repetitively seen in the play. The news of somebody's death is so vague and so unsure, but everybody seems to be okay with this because they are numbed by the kind of violence which has happened. You hear that somebody that you know may have died, so their existence is also ambiguous because that is the extent to which violence was present in the Democratic Republic of Congo at that time. And you have honor over life. This can be a theme as well. Honor is more important than life. When Sophie and Salima and Josephine and other women were thrown out from their own families for something that is not a fault of theirs at all, for being abused by a violent instigator somewhere else, these women had to go through the ravages and the plight of violence. They had to go through physical pain, the mental trauma of being abused, and at the same time, a sense of homelessness or rootlessness where their own families were not ready to accept them into their folds back again. Lynn Nottage tries to give voice to the sound of African women living in the shadows of war. How does war affect women? That was Nottage's greatest focus point. 3 dimensions of war, political dimensions of war. How do political factions create destruction? Second one is ethnic. People belonging to different ethnic communities lose so much in war and how it affects the bodies of women. Ruined deals with the war waged against women mostly. This play is not a writing about the War of Democratic Republic of Congo as a political event, but how that socio-political and cultural event specifically destructed the lives of women. And last, we have Nottage's aim at drawing 3-dimensional portraits of women. What are their thought processes? How do they deal with their life after being destructed by the violence of war? Instead of giving a single-dimensional flat image of what women go through, Lynn Nottage tries to create and communicate the stories of women through her writings. And to come to a conclusion, I have chosen a quote which Nottage herself has spoken about her writing, which we will read now. In Ruined, Mama Nadi gives 3 young women refuge and an unsavory means of survival, which is the business of flesh. As such, the women do a fragile dance between hope and disillusionment in an attempt to navigate life on the edge of an unforgiving conflict. My play is not about victims, but survivors. Ruined is also the story of the Congo, a country blessed with an abundance of natural beauty and resources, which has been its blessing and its curse. And on that note, this lecture is going to come to an end. I hope you use these points to understand the dimensions of the play much deeper, and I hope it gives you a great reading and feeling experience. Thank you.